Man, what's going on, everyone? Welcome back to the channel. I have another special video for you guys. I think I've pretty much exhausted every single iPhone out there, at least all the current ones and the ones that are still supported, but I kind of want to start doing more Androids, more Samsungs, Huawei's, all that stuff. And one of the phones that I looked at last year that I were going to relook at was the Samsung Galaxy S6 Edge Plus. Now, this phone is a mouthful. There's so many keywords in this phone. You got Samsung, you got Edge, you got Plus, you got the S6, which wasn't really that good, but it's okay. And this was a phone that I actually knew, like as soon as it was released, I kind of like knew about it, but it was kind of on the back burner. Like I thought it was like kind of like an accessory, kind of an unnecessary phone because the Galaxy S6 was there and the Edge was there. So there's no point in getting an even bigger phone than what we had. But now we're kind of in this trend of getting bigger and bigger and bigger phones. And this phone is kind of in that realm where it was pretty big at the time. Even now it's still pretty big, but I think it's kind of a good size too. Now looking around the body, I'll tell you one thing, man, when you have this thing in your hand, the body is one of the most premium things about this phone, and it still feels very, very premium. You have glass on the front, glass on the back. You have like an edged panel, I guess. I don't really know how else you would frame it. And it's a very, very good panel overall. It's AMOLED, Super AMOLED at that. It's 5.7 inches. It's 1440p. And in my opinion, the body is one of the best things about this phone. It's timeless. The screen is amazing. And I don't think this thing is going to break. Like if you compare this thing to like even like a Galaxy S9 or a Note 9 or whatever, you would probably obviously tell that the Note 9 feels a little bit more premium, and it looks a little bit more premium because it has less bezels and things, but in the hand, they both feel fairly similar. And I would go as far as to say in some cases, maybe the Galaxy S6 Edge Plus feels a little bit more premium. Now that's kind of an overstatement, but it's not like one feels way more premium than the other. Obviously the Note 9 is a much, much better phone than the Galaxy S6 Edge Plus. I might just start calling this the Edge Plus for the rest of this video. But what I'm saying is, man, the body is very, very premium. Like I said, a 5.7 inch Super AMOLED screen on the front. It's 1440p. It's a very good panel as well. Now, unfortunately, there is no IP68 dust and water resistance or anything like that. There might be a little water resistance that wasn't advertised, but as far as I can see, there was no water resistance. So that is kind of one thing to keep in mind. Now, this thing was released all the way back in August of 2015, which was around the same time the iPhone 6s was released. And I believe the Galaxy Note 5 was released the same year. So it was quite a bit of time ago. This was the same year that the Galaxy S6 was released, but this was released about like 5 months after. The Samsungs are usually released in February or March, so this one was released a little bit later, but it's good timing. I mean, I really like this. I think this had more so to do with the Galaxy Note 5 than it did with the Galaxy S6, so a little bit of difference there. Now, one of the interesting choices of this phone was probably software. So it was released with Android 5.1.1 Lollipop, and you can get it upgraded to Android 7.0, and that's really where it ended. It didn't really go too much further after that. I mean, it got security updates here and there, but here's the thing. I was looking for the roots and custom ROMs and all those things for it, and you are able to root some variants of this thing, so obviously do your research about that. But as far as custom ROMs go, there's not a lot of choices out there. I was looking through XDA, and there is a little bit of development. So there's like some Android Nougat ROMs. I guess there's an Android Oreo ROM. I saw an Android Pie ROM, a beta of it, and what I can tell you is like, yeah, there's some development behind this, but this is probably one of the first phones that I've recently tested, I would say in the last couple months, that has a very weak third-party community behind it, and there's probably a lot of sense behind it because this was a very niched phone. I don't think I've ever seen one person in real life own this phone. I've seen many people own a Galaxy S6, even the Galaxy S6 Edge, but a Galaxy S6 Edge Plus, I can't even say it. I don't think there's a lot of people who own this phone. I think the people who do own it, like it a lot maybe, but as far as software goes, I think it's pretty much hit a brick wall. I mean, when you're in a position where it's not even supported by the manufacturer, but one step further, it's not even supported by the people who own the phone, that's kind of one thing that's kind of a red flag to me that this phone could potentially be dying off. I mean, you look at phones like the Nexus 5 that was released forever ago, that thing still has some type of third-party community behind it. I think that has an Android Oreo ROM. Yeah, it does have an Android Oreo ROM. I've seen phones like other phones too, like the LG G2. That phone also has a little, very small community, but it's still strong enough to push these updates out. And this is one of those phones that I see a very weak community behind. So kind of one thing to keep in mind. I know a lot of people don't talk about software. They just say it has this in terms of specs. But when you look at the longevity of a phone, especially now, considering it's not even supported, I think it's one important thing to note. So in terms of software, I would say it's getting ready to hit a brick wall if it hasn't already hit that already. Now moving on to the performance and I guess the hardware aspect of it, this is actually one of the better aspects of the phone. So it has an Exynos 7400 octa chipset, an octa-core CPU, and 4 gigs of RAM. And what I can tell you is that in terms of just the overall performance, I think it's pretty good still. I mean, I really don't have too many problems with it. A lot of the problems associated with, I guess, the overall UI of it has a lot to do with TouchWiz. I just don't like TouchWiz that much. I've had a lot of problems with it, and I feel like it just bogs down the system memory quite a bit. Well, what I can tell you is that the specs of this phone still hold up very, very well. I mean, what I'll tell you is that this thing still has the same amount of RAM as the Google Pixel 3 XL that was just released. And this thing has the same amount of RAM as the iPhone XS Max. Now, that's not to say that this phone is the Google Pixel 3 XL or is better than the XS Max. I'm not saying that at all. What I'm saying is that in terms of the internal specs, this thing is still very, very decent. And I would say in terms of performance, it's still pretty decent too. And I've said this so many times, but nobody wants to quote me and nobody talks about it and nobody gives me any attention about it. But I always say, like, in iPhones, now this is not an iPhone versus Android thing, I'm not trying to go there, but what I'm trying to say is I'm trying to solidify this quote. So quote unquote, iOS and Android have the exact opposite problem. So in iOS, usually the software outlasts the hardware, but in terms of Android, the hardware usually outlasts the software. So what I mean by that is the iPhone 5S is still supported by iOS 12, but it's not the fastest phone. Like, the specs of it are very, very weak. 1 gig of RAM, barely, it's not that good, but it's still supported. So that's a huge plus. But you look at the Android side, the Samsung Galaxy S6 Edge Plus that we're reviewing now, this thing has 4 gigs of RAM and pretty good specs. I mean, octa-core CPU, but this thing is not supported by software anymore. So like I said, it has the kind of flip-flopped and flooped to all those other places. So that was a long-winded way of telling you that this performance of this phone in terms of day-to-day use isn't that bad, and even gaming isn't that bad either. I mean, it's not the best. There's a lot of games for some reason that aren't really optimized for Android Nougat if you keep it stock. If you go update it, then there's a little bit of a difference. But I'll probably tell you that the performance of this phone is definitely a plus on this phone. It's not really a way for me to hate on it, if that's one way to say it. Now moving on to the camera, this is honestly one of the best aspects of this phone. It has a 16 megapixel sensor on the back. It has optical image stabilization, and the photos on this thing are very, very good still. You shoot photos literally about anything. Take a photo of a rock, take a photo, whatever. The photos will look really, really good. Even in like indoor lighting, it's not that bad. One thing that I've noticed, and I say this about every single Samsung phone, I feel like the camera sensor and even the software implementation, whatever, of these Samsung phones always overexposes the photos, which in my opinion, I actually prefer this than having a darkened image. I don't know what other cameras out there that really darken the image, but maybe LG's cameras sometimes darken them. I've just had the G7 and the G6. Those phones usually tend to kind of darken a little bit, but Samsung, they really brighten the image out, and I really, really like it. I think that has a lot to do with the screen as well, because the screen of these devices are very, very good still. So in terms of the camera, I really, really like it, and you can shoot 4K videos on it, 1080p at up to 60 frames, and I like it overall. And the front camera is 5 megapixels. You can shoot 1440p videos on it too. And I'll tell you, man, the camera sensor on this thing is definitely a plus, both the front and the back camera. I would not consider these cameras to be a waste or anything like that. So the cameras have definitely held up on this phone 100%. Now, another thing that's held up quite a bit, not as much as I'd like, but it's decent, is actually the battery. So it has a 3000 milliamp hour battery. And honestly, in my opinion, they could have fit like a 3500 milliamp hour battery, even a 4000 milliamp hour battery on this thing. This thing is pretty large. It's not a small device. And I'm surprised they didn't put a bigger battery in. And now it does take micro USB, which isn't really a good plus, but this thing also has Qi wireless charging. So that's a huge plus right there. And I'll tell you, man, the battery life isn't as good as I thought it would be. And I thought it would be a plus, but it's really not. Here's the thing, because this phone is kind of big, it has a large screen, its performance, it has a lot of specs inside of it that are pretty heavy. I would have expected a little bit of a bigger battery, but also because this thing's running TouchWiz and has a lot of bloatware that doesn't need to be there, I feel like this thing could have been a better machine had the software been stock, or if the battery had been bigger to compensate for TouchWiz. And I'll definitely say that the battery size is pretty average, but the battery life is below average. And the other thing you have to keep in mind is that if you're getting this phone, it's probably going to be used. I don't think you're going to get this phone brand new. And the battery size has probably decreased quite a bit, due to degradation over time. It's not just Samsung, it's all phones. Everything with a battery degrades over time. So it's not at the full 3000 milliamp hours anymore. It's probably at like 2500, 2400, probably even lower than that, depending how the person who bought this phone before you had it before treated it. So what I'll tell you is that the battery life definitely isn't a plus for me, and it kind of brings the value of this phone down quite a bit to me, because I don't know, I just feel like they could have done a better job at it. Now, some other things to know, like I said, a beautiful screen. This thing also has a fingerprint sensor on the front, so that's pretty interesting. This thing also has a headphone jack. And this thing does not have any expandable storage, so you cannot put a micro SD card slot in it or anything. So is the Galaxy S6 Edge Plus still worth it in 2019? What I'll say is no, I don't think this phone is still worth it in 2019. You know, if this thing had a little bit of a bigger ROM community behind it, of a custom ROM community, I would 100% still recommend it. But because it's still kind of in that niche market where it's like not a lot of people owned it, a lot of people still don't even own the regular Galaxy S6 or the S6 Edge Plus or the S6. So there's very little people beyond that in the Android market, in the Samsung market even, that own the Edge Plus. So I'll kind of say that this phone isn't a waste if you currently own it. I mean, this phone feels like a very, very premium phone, but I feel like they could have just done a better job at making it a little bit more future-proof in terms of software at least. So I'm not going to leave you hanging though. I would totally 100% recommend you buying a Samsung Galaxy S8 or even a Galaxy S8 Plus over the S6 Edge Plus. That those phones are still supported by software, and they're very, very premium phones as well. And you know, they're the bigger brothers of these things. So I'll leave some links in the description for a Galaxy S8 and a Samsung Galaxy S8 Plus if you want to pick those up. I try to find the cheapest prices on Amazon and link them straight below. So if you want to buy your products for the lowest prices I found on Amazon and also help out the channel at the same time, definitely get them through those links. I'd really appreciate it. But that is pretty much it. If you guys have any questions or anything like that, leave it down in the comment section below. Hit that like button, that'll mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. Every single subscriber that we get really does count, so it'll mean so much if you guys can hit that. Also check out the other links down in the description as well. My Twitter, my Instagram, my second channel, all those links are linked down below. I would really appreciate if you guys could check it out. But more importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.